that require very thorough probing to penetrate. What I have tried to show in this book is how complex it is, and toward the back, if you get the 8 cases presented very often and very fully in first-person form rather than me telling you, I let the people tell you. And this is based 99% on their conscious recollections, not on hypnotically retrieved information so that the debunkers can say, oh, it was false memory or somebody implanted the idea. This is from their conscious lives, what they live with every day, without hypnosis. And really, that's more representative of what most abductees go through, because most of us don't have anybody to do hypnotic work with us. It's the exception rather than the rule that you find a competent hypnotist that knows how to probe these streamed memories. So it does take you inside what it's like to live with this. Now I want to read you, just for a little example, a page and a half from this book. It's a prologue, and it's excerpts from 3 of these cases at 3 different times in our recent history. The first is from Indiana, and it's in 1954. And this is a quote. This is from the case of Pat. They came in our house and set up equipment in the living room, Pat said. The Army men wanted to talk to me the most. Me, an 11-year-old girl with secrets in my head. But the aliens told me I couldn't tell, because they said there'll be those who will tamper with your mind. And here they were, the tamperers, the Army men. 2 female doctors set up their gear in the bedroom, where Pat was given an injection. It made me sleepy, she said. And I lay on my mom's bed on some towels, and I told them my story. I even told them, you're in my mom's bedroom where the white glowing ones were. You don't belong here, but they do. And I'll elaborate a little bit more on this 1954 incident in just a moment. Now let's jump 20 years. Let's jump to 1978, Puerto Rico. 2 aliens took Beth down a curved hall and through a door into a different area. It looked like a surgery room, she said, and she became afraid they were going to kill her there. A third entity, holding a black box, moved to a position behind Beth. She could not see what he did, but she felt as if her head was being opened and her brain removed, all without any sensation of pain. After she was all put back together again, as she said, a cold liquid was poured over her head. When this procedure was finished, the alien stood in front of her, and Beth realized that mentally she was different. Her thoughts about everything were changed, and she was filled with new ideas about God and the unity of all life within the Supreme Source. This very spiritual moment was followed by a quite physical exam, as the aliens took samples of her skin and her hair. A human-looking man with a widow's peak hairline entered the room and made a full examination of her body, including a gynecological procedure. Then he explained many things, telling her that she and other humans had been chosen to carry out certain jobs in the future. Now let's jump to Texas 20 years after that, 1992. And this is the case of Amy. Quote, the masked alien explained that her race had been doing things to humans that they should not be doing, Amy said. She, this alien, and several groups of her race and others wanted to stop the abuse of humans by her race. They were working with certain people on Earth to stop the process. The other humans in the room were ex-pilots, military officials, and other professionals. They were all working together to stop the alien intrusion. She showed me the thing she had pulled out of my neck and said, this implant is embedded deep in the spinal cord. The thing controlled the muscles of the body when activated. It blocked the brain and became the central command of the body. I don't want to remember how or why this thing functions. Now you get 3 very different, very individualized scenarios from these 3 reports. But when you look at the totality of what Pat and Beth and the other 5 women in this book experienced, as I spell out in a several long-page chart of comparison of detailed reports, you will see that as an individual, as each of these accounts has been, overall the pattern is extremely consistent. And I'm going to talk about the real nature of this pattern, not what you've been hearing, not what you've read, but what really is going on in this report. In this book, these 8 women come from Texas, Tennessee, Alabama, Florida, New York, and Puerto Rico. They ranged in age at the time this research began from age 26 to age 50. None of them knew the other when this began. 3 of the women are married, 4 are divorced, 1 is widowed, and 6 of the 8 have children. All right. Although there's this highly individual approach to each of these events, when you look at the entirety of the experiences, here are some of the shared details that we find in common, and all of these, I think, are going to raise some pretty important questions in your mind. First,
if you adjust the microphone, your voice is very muffled.
Is it?
Yeah,
I'm
the
sorry.
fidelity is not good.
How about this? Is that better?
You need a little bass in that mix, and I guess it's the sound guy. You need a little bass drum.
Can
Not too
you
much
help
treble.
the sound guy?
Yeah, your battery's dead.
Battery.
Thank you very much.
I was just talking about that. Yeah. That's good.
Very much. All right, let's start with first the nature of the contacts themselves. What do we have reported? UFO sightings, missing time during childhood, missing time during the adult phase, consciously recall scenarios both individually and with other people, virtual reality scenarios, and we're going to talk about that in some specifics a little bit later when we get to the second book, Masquerade of Angels especially, and telepathic communications. All of these constitute the kinds of contacts and experiences that abductees report. Just because you don't have them in the room touching your body, but you have them telepathically delivering information, this still is a contact. This is still part of the abduction scenario. And they vary from right in your face to remote communication to unreal, real-seeming events perpetrated mentally upon the abductees. What kind of creatures are we hearing in these reports? What are their descriptions? We get the grays. You know about the little short grays that act like they're robotic or android or insectoid in their actions that don't seem to have individuality. The little workers, and we're going to talk about those to some degree. You get insectoid-looking creatures. Tall, thin, normally very white, very skinny arms, 2 to 3 digits, triangular shaped head with insectoid eyes. I've seen them, my son's seen them, many of you have probably seen them. I've talked to a few people here who've seen them. Reptoids, very robust creatures, normally tall, very scaly, smooth in one direction, sticky in the other when you rub over the skin pattern, clawed, webbed, and these guys have teeth, unlike the little grays. Then you get the white, humanoid-looking, not human-looking, but humanoid-looking, tall, thin, white, sometimes with very deeply wrinkled faces, with round eyes rather than the slanted eyes. And these, too, have mouths that open. When my husband was 11 months old and was abducted, he was allowed to put his finger in the mouth of one of these creatures. And he said it didn't have teeth. It had spongy, soft tissue, sort of like in a whale's mouth. You get blue humanoid-looking figures, very often reported. Not green necessarily, although those do come up, but more often blue than green. There are numerous reports of things that the abductees describe as dwarves or elves or trolls, very small, sometimes hairy, sometimes big-eared creatures. And then there's several varieties of completely human-looking individuals that show up in some of these accounts. Usually they're either blonde and beautiful, what we call the Nordic, the Pleiadian, or they're tall, very commanding, very much in charge, dark-haired humans with this widow peak hairline. Sometimes it looks artificial. Sometimes it looks even painted on. But nonetheless, those are the two most commonly reported human-looking type of creatures. But other figures turn up too in these accounts, and they're probably not what they appear to be at all when you start looking at the evidence. For instance, dead relatives are sometimes involved in these scenarios, and I'll give you one instance from Masquerade of Angels. Ted Rice, who's the subject of the book, was abducted with his grandmother when he was 8 years old. They were both given a liquid to drink. It very much altered their perceptions and their control. In fact, it acted somewhat as an aphrodisiac, and this has been reported in numerous other cases. The reptoid creatures approached the grandmother and wanted to have a sexual encounter with her. And she said, "I don't do that. I've only ever done that with my husband, and my husband's been dead 6 years, so I don't do that." Within a few minutes, they brought her dead husband into the room. And they engaged in sex. And in the middle of the sexual encounter, she realized it wasn't the dead husband at all. But the image was strong enough to convince her in the beginning that it was. Also, celebrities show up. President Clinton, Michael Jackson, Ted Danson, Shirley MacLaine. I mean, we've had all sorts of reports of celebrities involved in these abduction experiences, as if the aliens are drawing some image out of the abductee's mind that they think will make that person amenable to what's going on. And even religious figures show up, most commonly Jesus. Now, we're dealing in this country. Maybe if we were in India, Buddha would show up more, or Krishna would show up more, but right here we get Jesus. And in fact, Pat, the girl whose family was sequestered in 1954 in Indiana after a UFO encounter that abducted her entire family, the next day military personnel showed up, sequestered her family on their farm for 5 days, and interrogated them with using drugs to do so. 54. At the time this encounter took place with the aliens, Pat and her grandmother were in the same bedroom when the little grays started coming in, and they started freaking out. The grandmother especially started saying, "Oh, Jesus, what's going on?" Well, lo and behold, a little blue beam comes through the ceiling, and there's Jesus in the room saying, "It's all right, they're with me. Go with them, they're with me." And I asked Pat, I said, "What did Jesus look like?" And she said, "Well, he was beautiful. He was tall and handsome and had blue eyes and blonde hair." And I said, "Pat, have you read your Bible lately?" I don't think there's much of a chance that Jesus had blue eyes and blonde hair. And like so many other abductees in the same situation, she said, "Well, this one did. It worked. Grandma went with him. After all, Jesus said they're with him. Go to it." Now, these improbable figures that we know are not the dead grandmother, are Michael Jackson, are Jesus himself in these situations, are very often part of what we call the virtual reality technology, where images can be created and perpetrated that feel absolutely as real as you and I feel right here today. And they are very persuasive when you are already under a control. And the one rule of thumb in the abduction encounter, no matter what you think, no matter what you remember, and no matter what you felt, you were under control when it happened. And they controlled how you saw it and how you felt about it and what you remember of it. And when you're in that form of controlled state, they can make you think Jesus himself is there, or your dead grandmother's there, or President Clinton wants to have sex with you. All right? Now then, what are they doing? What kinds of exams and procedures are we getting representative reports about? Besides the things you already know pretty well from the literature, like the taking of skin, the taking of hair, the taking of fingernails and body fluid samples and sperm and ova and fetuses, and this is what you've been told about for the most part goes on. There are other widely reported exams and procedures that I think have very little or nothing to do with crossbreeding our spiritual agenda. For one thing, most every single abductee has what's called a mind scan performed on them. The creature gets right up in your face, the eyes take over control, and you are scanned. In fact, one little girl said, "They filmed my soul." Now, this is out of the mouths of babes, and we ought to listen to these babes a lot more than we normally tend to do when it comes to this phenomenon. For women, almost every one of the abductees that are female undergo gynecological procedures of various sorts, sometimes painful, sometimes not. But the result and the after effects are that many, many, many abductees, much higher than the national average, suffer from extremely severe gynecological problems after being used by the aliens in these procedures. In fact, we have a report very recently of a 10-year-old girl who just had to have a hysterectomy because of what they had done with her. It's getting younger and younger. There are also many implantations performed on abductees. You've heard about the little BB probes that are put up the nose and go penetrate into here like my husband had when he and his best friend were abducted when they were 12. As often, or maybe even more often, they use behind the eye. As you heard with Barbara's presentation today, they take the eye out, they do the implant behind it, put the eye back in. They also put them in through the ear. Most recently, they've begun putting them behind the ear into the base of the brain. And very often, they go into the spine at some point, ranging from the base of the neck all the way down to the bottom of the spine. All right, what does this have to do with crossbreeding or spiritual elevation, you might wonder, as I do. Many abductees report the brain surgery, like Beth, when they opened her head and took out her brain. This report is as common as the sperm and ova taking, although you don't hear about it as often. And people who have this happen use almost the same phrase. They opened my head and took out my brain. Word for word. I can repeat it on tape after tape, the same scenario. Certain kinds of instruments are repeatedly reported as part of these procedures. You know about the little light bar or light wand that's used to scan over the body. This is very, very common. You know about the little small box, usually a little black box, that's reported in many of these scenarios. We don't know up until this point. Perhaps we know now, but we did not know what this little black box was all about. In Masquerade of Angels, I think you'll find some information that may shed light on what that little black box is all about. And I don't think you're going to be real happy with it, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway if you read the book. A long needle device, sometimes into the brain, sometimes into the abdomen, sometimes into other areas, even into between the toes, is reported repeatedly. And then, of course, there's the infamous alien dentist chair. How many of you have been in that? You're in the chair, the equipment pulls down from overhead, and you get the little laser type or razor type or probe type device that is used in any number of areas on the body. These are very similar from report to report to report. Abductees are very frequently given an unknown liquid to drink. No explanation for what this is about. Sometimes they're given a substance to swallow or to eat with no explanation of what it is. And the results of these liquids and these pills or substances are varying. Sometimes it's dizziness, loss of consciousness, extreme nausea, and sexual stimulation. All of these are frequently reported from these substances we are made to ingest. What are the aliens communicating in these scenarios? Well, very often they don't communicate a darn thing. You're out, you don't get to ask questions, they don't answer any questions, they do the procedure and you're back home and that's it. But they do sometimes communicate certain things. Sometimes it's merely directions. Don't be afraid. Yeah, sure, don't be afraid. Lie still. Don't touch certain things. They have told them not to touch aliens, not to touch things on the ship, not to touch the ship itself. Don't touch. These are some of the kinds of directions abductees are given in communications. Many abductees are given certain other kind of communications. You are special. You are chosen. You're the golden child. You have a mission. And they are told this sort of information, that they are selected for some great honor or mission or task. Sometimes the aliens communicate a lot of information about the origin of the human species, and you know what it mostly says? We made you. We altered what you were. We changed you. We own you. You're our product. Sometimes they make a lot of statements about the separation of the soul and the body. And they seem to be doing this more and more lately, stressing, don't be so attached to that physical body. It's just a container. It's just a vessel. Why, it's not important. Now, why do you think they would want to downgrade the physical form that God chose to put us in and tell us it's not important? It was important enough for God to make it. It was important enough that this is how we are born. Why do you think they might be stressing, hey, don't be so attached to that body, it's not really important? You might want to think about why that would be something they want us to believe. Very often they deliver warnings about the current terrible condition of the planet, or about some impending destruction that we're going to bring on ourselves, or that nature is going to bring on the planet, and so on. We get a lot of warnings. And then occasionally there's some weird things like certain musical sounds are heard, or aliens are heard chattering in their own language, which is incomprehensible to the person. They talk about it as a bird-type sound, or a bumbling, buzzing, humming sort of noise that they try to describe, and there's really not a way to do that in human terms. But we sometimes get reports of aliens communicating to each other in a verbal form. All right, now in addition to these exams and procedures that are reported, there's also other kind of activities that abductees report. And you probably, some of you here, had some of these. Very often, they have teaching or testing sessions with abductees, from childhood through adulthood. Sometimes, and I have this many, many times reported very specifically, and sometimes in more than one generation in the family, they taught me how to walk through walls. They taught me how to pass through solid objects. They taught me how to use my mind to move objects. They taught me how to affect electrical impulses with my brain. They taught me telekinesis. They taught me levitation. Now, the people are able to perform these things when they're with the aliens, but when they get up the next morning and try to walk through that wall, it doesn't happen. All right? So it seems to only work when you're with the aliens, but they're spending years sometimes teaching people how to pass through solid objects. We do know about the crossbreeding activities. Yes, they take sperm, they take ova, they take fetuses. This is a given. It really does happen. But maybe it's not about crossbreeding. Maybe it's about something else. We won't want to talk about that in just a second. I know we're running short on some time, so I want to get down to the nitty-gritty. Often there's an immersion into a pool of liquid that the abductee is forced to inhale, thinking they're going to drown, but they find they can breathe this liquid. Very often they present scenarios or visions of past events in the person's lives, or future events on the global scale. They'll show futuristic war scenes, or the planet blowing up, or the moon exploding, or terrible floods, or earthquakes, or chaos as a future event. And this is used as part of the programming. And they often tell us, you're going to have a job to do when this happens. And finally, there is the great variety of sexual activity that is perpetrated upon abductees. And I'm talking almost every variety of the sex act that you can imagine, with aliens, with things we don't even know what they are, and with abductees among abductees. They may take an abductee from one place and an abductee from another and force them into sexual activity together. They don't know each other. They don't know if that person has AIDS. They don't know what the condition is, but they are forced into sexual activity, and this is repeatedly done. In fact, in one case in here that's so heartbreaking, Lisa, the woman in Alabama, last year was abducted, and there was another man, another abductee that she was forced to engage in a sexual act with, and the man apologized to her very, very deeply. He said, I'm sorry, they make me do this. They've been taking me since I was a child. I can't help it. I'm sorry. And again, this is reported in many different instances. And I'm not just talking about genital intercourse. I'm talking about a variety of sexual acts. And I'm talking about on people as old as in their 70s and on children as young as 3 years old. In fact, one abductee adult mother of 2 children who was fairly happy with her sexual activity to a certain point, well, she said it was some of the best sex she ever had, was not at all disturbed that she was repeatedly being forced into these sexual encounters until one morning she gets up and her 5-year-old daughter is sexually manipulating the 3-year-old daughter, and aghast she says, what are you doing? She says, Mommy, we're just doing what the little doctors do to us when they come in the bedroom at night. Are they crossbreeding? Are they taking ova from 3-year-old children? I have a problem with this. Now, where do these activities take place? Very often they're right there in your home, in the bedroom, in the living room, in the kitchen, sometimes in the car when you're traveling. Sometimes people are taken aboard what seems to be a UFO craft. Very often they're taken, however, to some facility that is neither in the home nor on the craft. And the reports from people that I call UFO virgins, that is, people who do not study this phenomenon, who very often don't know anybody else has had these things happen, and they wouldn't know Bud Hopkins or John Lear from you or me. That's how little they know. Report identical scenarios, and I want to tell you what these include. They very often include what is clearly an underground facility. And in this underground facility, 3 basic types of activities and setups are reported. The first is what appears to be like a military base, and very often there are humans as well as aliens in this facility, where there are craft and there are activities going on such as a base might have going on. The second commonly reported underground facility is one in which apparently scientific research seems to be carried out, including, again, both alien and human workers. And the third type is what we've come to call the processing plant. And this, again, often has both human and alien personnel working in it. And in this underground processing plant, what we get reported over and over again is a setup in which human body parts are being processed like chicken or beef. They are being flayed, they are being dismembered, they are being drained of blood, they are sometimes reported stacked up like firewood, sometimes hanging, draining, sometimes going down, being dismembered as they go towards some unknown end facility. I don't make it up, and I don't necessarily believe it's real, but I know that it's what they really put in these people's minds. Whether it's virtual reality or reality, why are they doing it? What is the purpose of such a scenario, either real or imagined? Why would they do this to our people? What does it imply? And these are reported, like I said, from UFO virgins as well as from people who are familiar with this field. Hybrid nursery rooms are very, very often reported, often containers that have liquid and fetuses at various levels of growth that often look partially human, partially alien. Sometimes they're in boxes rather than in containers with liquid. Sometimes they're in nursery settings where they seem to be hybrid toddlers. And then there are the cloning rooms, rooms where fully formed, fully human, but inert bodies are stored. Sometimes in coffin-like boxes, sometimes with stored in upright cylinder containers, and they are sometimes identical, like 20 identical female bodies, 20 identical male bodies, and sometimes their bodies are identical to the abductee who is being shown this. In fact, in this book, 3 of the women were shown clones of their bodies. And what explanations were given for these clones? Well, Pat, remember the one where Jesus beamed in and said, "They're with me"? Pat was told when she was shown her clone body that it was for the resurrection. Well, haven't you read your Bible? They're going to have a new body at the day of resurrection, and we're the ones in charge of making them. Here is yours. You're safe. You got a resurrection body. Lisa, on the other hand, shown her cloned body, was told that it would be used to replace her if she did not cooperate in what they wanted her to do, and nobody would ever know the difference. Which story are we going to buy? Can we buy either story? Have we ever been told the truth on any of this so far? Well, when the stories conflict this much, we have a question with how much truth there may be to this. Well, I know we're running out of time. I was going to talk about the external effects, the peripheral effects in the home, which that's all outlined here in the comparative chart. The after effects, I think, are important. What do people report as the after effects? Sleep disorder, stress, post-traumatic stress symptoms, fear of talking about their experiences. In fact, many people experience physical pain when they try to talk about these experiences, and the pain doesn't come from any real body symptom. It comes from a triggering device, either through implant or through suggestion. Shifts in attitudes. People's attitudes change radically. They become more ecologically aware. They become more compassionate. They become more non-traditional in their spiritual and religious views. And many, many times, as Jane, one of the abductees in here, had to say, they foster a mistrust of our government within us. Maybe we ought to be mistrustful, but they certainly work to make us so in many cases. They often become convinced they have a mission to perform. Thank you. They're given certain kinds of dreams. Most notably, 3 different kinds of dreams are reported over and over again. One dream I call from one abductee's report, the night of lights, and that some of you may have had this dream when the sky is literally filled with UFOs, and it's when they're coming now. This dream is very, very, very common among abductees. The second kind of dream, earthly disasters, great floods, great earthquakes, great cataclysm in which the abductees have a job to do, reported over and over again. And the third kind of dream reported frequently is that of a prophetic event. And many, many times abductees dream about certain events that actually do come to pass. Very often they're disaster events. Gynecological problems we've already talked about. Sexual dysfunction is a very common after effect of this. Marital problems rife after this happens. I can't tell you how many abductees in the last 2 years have gone through divorces when they were happily married before. It is extraordinary the kind of stress on the relationships these people experience as after effects. Degradation. Now, as many people who realize a spiritual awakening and uprising from the experience, we got the other side where they go through the degradation of their personal lives, as we talked about with the drug abuse, the promiscuity, the self-destructive behavior, the suicidal tendencies. What do we know about human involvement from these reports? Of these 8 women, 4 have been abducted and interrogated by military human personnel. They want to know what's going on just like you and I do, but they're using better technology to try to get their information than you or I have. We have military personnel, medical personnel, scientific research personnel, very, very often working with aliens on board craft or in the facilities. We see an increase in helicopter activity over the homes of abductees when they begin dealing with this or having current situations. We get the phone surveillance, we get the mail surveillance, we get people followed, we get people with taps on their wires, people whose homes are broken into and the only thing taken is UFO-related documents, etc. And then, of course, the interrogations like Pat's family went through in 1954 and my husband went through in 1988, and 4 of the women in this book have experienced on military-based facilities at the hands of military personnel. So that's what you're going to find spelled out in much greater detail than I can go into in 20 minutes here in Taken. And I hope you'll have a chance to look at that at some point. The book that will be out next month is called Masquerade of Angels. Barbara and I have been working on this for a couple of years now, and it's an ongoing research project. This involves Ted Rice, a man who was born in Alabama, who was born to a very ordinary family. He was a rural cotton patch kid. He grew up in the cotton patch farm area of northern Alabama. But from a very early age, he began to have a series of extremely paranormal events. Before he was even in school, these go back, and we go through, in Masquerade of Angels, we go through very thoroughly documented instances of paranormal events in his life. And these things led him, molded the journey he went on in his life, and brought him to where he was a psychic worker, a light worker, if you will, trying through his psychic talents to lead people to understand there's more to this world than we think, that when you die, it's not the end, that we get communications from the dead who've gone on to the other side, and here's proof. I can give you proof through my psychic readings, and Ted did this for 20 years, very happily, very successfully, and believing that he was being guided by spirits with God's blessing to do this work.